The biting wind whipped through the parking lot of a small-town Michigan grocery store, carrying with it the faint smell of gasoline and damp pavement. Clara huddled against the cold brick wall, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the icy air. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, as she clutched a crumpled $5 bill and stared at the cracked asphalt beneath her worn sneakers. In her arms, Lily wailed, her cries sharp and desperate, echoing off the concrete like a plea no one could answer. The baby's tiny face was red, tears streaming down her cheeks as hunger gnawed at her belly. Clara pressed her lips together, trying to hold back her own tears, but they spilled over anyway, hot streaks cutting paths down her pale cheeks. A man walked past, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He glanced at Clara, his expression unreadable, before looking away quickly. That fleeting moment of judgment felt heavier than the weight of the world on her shoulders. She hugged Lily closer, the blanket around the baby scratchy and threadbare, its edges frayed from too many washes. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what else to do." Inside the store, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unforgiving glow on rows of canned goods and fresh produce that might as well have been behind iron bars, for all the good. They did her. The warmth seeping out of the automatic doors mocked her, a reminder of everything she couldn't provide. Hunger wasn't just in her stomach, it clawed at her heart, whispering cruel lies about failure and worthlessness. This is where our story begins. Not with grand gestures or sweeping landscapes, but with raw humanity. If you've ever wondered how far empathy can go, or how much one act of kindness can change lives, you'll want to stay tuned. Subscribe now to follow this emotional journey of resilience, redemption, and the power of connection. Clara Hayes, or rather, Clara Thompson before life had stripped away any semblance of stability, was only 22 years old, but she carried herself like someone who'd lived twice that. Her once bright eyes, now dulled by exhaustion and fear, reflected a mixture of stubborn determination and quiet despair. She was the kind of woman people might overlook in a crowd. Small, unassuming, with mousy brown hair pulled into a messy bun, but there was something about her, a flicker of fire beneath the surface that hinted at untapped strength. Clara had dreams once, big ones. College applications filled out late at night after shifts at the diner, visions of becoming a teacher dancing in her head. But then came Lily, born too soon into a world that felt determined to break them both. Now those dreams were buried under unpaid bills, missed meals, and sleepless nights spent rocking a crying baby. What drove Clara wasn't ambition anymore. It was survival, for herself and for Lily. Every decision, every sacrifice, stemmed from one unshakable truth: she would do anything to give her daughter a better life than the one they were living. Lily, though barely 6 months old, already seemed to understand the weight of their circumstances. Her wide blue eyes darted around constantly, taking in the cold world with a mix of curiosity and confusion. She cooed when happy, cried when hungry, and clung to Clara like a lifeline. To Clara, Lily wasn't just her child, she was hope wrapped in a tiny blanket, a reason to keep going even when the odds felt insurmountable. Yet Lily's cries also served as a constant reminder of everything Clara couldn't provide. Each sob pierced her heart like a knife, forcing her to confront the harsh reality of her failures. Daniel Hayes, on the other hand, moved through life like a man perpetually chasing something he could never quite catch. At 48, he was the CEO of Hayes Tech, a company he'd built from the ground up with grit, intelligence, and an almost obsessive drive for success. Tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and piercing grey eyes, Daniel exuded confidence. But beneath his polished exterior lay cracks, deep ones. The loss of his relationship with his own daughter, Emily, haunted him. A decade earlier, pride and miscommunication had driven a wedge between them, leaving him estranged from the family he'd worked so hard to support. He told himself he didn't have time for regret, yet moments like this one, a chance encounter outside a grocery store, forced him to face the emptiness inside. What connected these two souls, despite their vastly different worlds, was a shared ache. For Clara, it was the pain of fighting against a system stacked against her, of loving someone so deeply it hurt. For Daniel, it was the guilt of knowing. He'd let the most important person in his life slip away because he hadn't known how to say, "I'm sorry." When their paths crossed that evening in the grocery store parking lot, neither realized how profoundly they would impact each other's lives. Their meeting wasn't coincidence, it was fate nudging them toward redemption. And while neither was ready to admit it yet, both desperately needed what the other had to offer. Clara needed help without judgment, and Daniel needed forgiveness without conditions. Together, they formed the emotional core of a story that asks us to consider not just what we're capable of giving, but what we stand to gain when we open our hearts to others. The parking lot stretched out under a sky the color of faded denim, clouds heavy with the promise of snow, pressing down on the small Michigan town like an unspoken weight. The air carried a sharp bite, the kind that seeped through jackets and nipped at exposed skin, leaving cheeks flushed and fingers numb. It smelled faintly of gasoline from the idling cars lined up near the pumps, mingling with the metallic tang of melting ice and the sour tang of spilled soda that had long since dried into sticky patches on the cracked asphalt. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their pale glow casting harsh shadows across the uneven ground, where weeds pushed stubbornly through cracks, defiant in their refusal to be ignored. Somewhere nearby, a shopping cart lay abandoned, its wheels caked with dirt, one of them squeaking softly as it rocked back and forth in the wind. Inside the grocery store, warmth pooled around the entrance, spilling out onto the pavement in waves that clashed with the biting cold outside. The scent of fresh bread wafted through the automatic doors, teasing anyone within reach with the illusion of comfort and abundance. Shelves groaned under the weight of canned goods, cereal boxes stood neatly stacked, and apples gleamed under artificial light, their waxy surfaces almost too perfect to touch. But for Clara, sitting just beyond this manufactured haven, those smells weren't inviting, they were taunting. They whispered cruel reminders of everything she couldn't afford, everything she couldn't give Lily. The hum of cash registers punctuated the quiet murmurs of shoppers inside, each beep marking another transaction, another life moving forward while hers felt frozen in place. Outside, the world seemed raw and unforgiving. The wind howled between buildings, carrying with it the occasional clatter of loose paper or the distant rumble of traffic along the main road. Streetlights flickered faintly, their orange glow casting pools of light onto the pavement, interrupted only by the dark silhouettes of passing strangers who hurried past without meeting her gaze. Some glanced briefly at Clara before looking away, their expressions unreadable but tinged with discomfort, as if poverty were something contagious, something they could catch simply by acknowledging her existence. Others didn't even slow down, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement as they disappeared into the warmth of their cars or the store's fluorescent embrace. For Clara, every sensation, the biting cold, the relentless cries of Lily, the oppressive silence of indifference, felt amplified, magnified by her helplessness. This wasn't just a setting, it was a living, breathing entity that bore down on her, squeezing until she thought she might break. Yet amid the bleakness there were tiny details that hinted at humanity. The faint echo of laughter from somewhere far off, the way the light caught the edge of a discarded candy wrapper turning, it momentarily golden. These fragments lingered like whispers of hope, fragile but persistent, urging her and the audience to hold on just a little longer. Clara's main conflict wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity. Every day she wrestled with a question that gnawed at her soul. How do you protect your child when you can barely protect yourself? Hunger wasn't the only enemy pressing down on her. It was shame, guilt, and the suffocating fear of failure. Clara knew what people thought when they saw her sitting outside the grocery store, cradling Lily in her arms, while tears streaked her face. She could read it in their hurried glances, the way some looked away too quickly or others stared for a moment too long. They saw her as broken, helpless, maybe even reckless. What they didn't see was the war raging inside her, the fierce determination to keep fighting, even when every breath felt like drowning. The stakes were impossibly high. For Clara, losing meant more than going hungry or being evicted from their tiny apartment. It meant failing Lily, the one person who depended on her completely. Failure wasn't an abstract concept. It was visceral, tangible, a specter looming over every decision she made. Should she use the last of her money to buy formula or pay for another night of heat? Could she risk asking for help without feeling like she was admitting defeat? These weren't hypotheticals. They were choices she faced daily, each one chipping away at whatever fragile sense of self-worth she had left. And yet, despite everything, Clara refused to let despair consume her entirely. There was still fire in her, flickering, yes, but alive. That fire burned brightest whenever she looked at Lily, whose wide blue eyes seemed to hold all the innocence and trust in the world. How could Clara give up when those eyes begged her to keep going? But this internal battle wasn't fought alone. Enter Daniel Hayes, whose polished exterior masked his own private torment. While Clara grappled with the immediacy of poverty, Daniel carried the weight of unresolved grief. The estrangement from his daughter Emily haunted him, not because he missed her presence necessarily, but because he couldn't forgive himself for letting pride get in the way of reconciliation. When he saw Clara and Lily huddled against the cold brick wall, something stirred deep within him, a mix of pity, responsibility, and perhaps even envy. Here was a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her child, while he had let years slip by without so much as a phone call to his own daughter. What would it take, he wondered, to make things right? Their conflicts intertwined in ways neither fully understood at first. For Clara, accepting help from someone like Daniel meant confronting her deepest fears, that she wasn't enough, that she'd always need saving, that relying on others somehow diminished her worth. For Daniel, reaching out to Clara forced him to reckon with his own shortcomings. Was he helping her out of genuine compassion, or was he trying to ease his guilt? Could he truly offer redemption to someone else when he hadn't found it for himself? Both characters stood at crossroads, unsure which path would lead to salvation and which to further ruin. And here lies the heart of the story, the central dilemma that binds them together. Clara needs food, shelter, and security, but more than anything, she needs hope. Daniel has resources, influence, and experience, but what he lacks is purpose. Together they represent two sides of the same coin: vulnerability and strength, regret and resilience. Their journey will challenge not only their perceptions of each other, but also their understanding of themselves. So now, ask yourself, if you were Clara, clutching a crying baby in sub-zero temperatures, how far would you go to ensure her survival? Would you swallow your pride and accept help from someone you barely know, or would you cling to independence no matter the cost? And if you were Daniel, walking past someone at their lowest point, would you step in or walk away? Because in the end, this isn't just Clara's story or Daniel's story, it's ours. It's a mirror reflecting our own capacity for empathy, forgiveness, and change. And it's a reminder that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Clara's first real crisis came not with fanfare or dramatics, but with the quiet cruelty of inevitability, the kind that sneaks up on you when you're too tired to notice until it's already crushing your chest. It started with the realization that her crumpled $5 bill, a relic from a time when she thought things might turn around, wasn't enough to buy even half a day's worth of food for Lily. She stood in front of the grocery store shelves, staring at rows of formula cans like they were mocking her, their prices printed in bold letters that seemed to grow larger the longer she looked. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cheapest option, only to pull back at the last second, shame burning hot against her cheeks. What good was buying something she couldn't afford if it meant skipping rent next week? How could she feed Lily today if doing so left them homeless tomorrow? The weight of indecision settled heavily on her shoulders, pressing down until standing felt like an impossible feat. Around her, shoppers moved briskly, grabbing items without hesitation, their carts filling with ease, while hers remained empty, save for the ache in her arms where Lily rested. The baby stirred, whimpering softly, and Clara pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, though her voice cracked under the strain. "We'll figure this out." But deep down, doubt gnawed at her resolve, whispering cruel truths she couldn't ignore. You can't fix this. You're failing her. Outside, the biting wind bit harder than before, slicing through her thin jacket like knives made of ice. Clara trudged back to the parking lot, defeated, clutching nothing but guilt and regret. As she sank onto the cold concrete again, pulling Lily closer to shield her from the chill, Daniel appeared once more. This time he didn't just glance. He stopped, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached. His expression was unreadable. A mask of professionalism tinged with something softer, something almost human. He held out a bag filled with groceries, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. Here, he said simply. Take it. For a moment, Clara froze, torn between gratitude and humiliation. Accepting charity felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that she couldn't handle life on her own. Yet rejecting help meant going hungry tonight and letting Lily cry until sleep claimed her out of sheer exhaustion. Her pride warred with desperation, each side pulling her in opposite directions until she thought she might split apart. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was likely only seconds, she reached for the bag, her fingers brushing against his. Briefly, the contact startled her, sending a jolt of electricity through her palm that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with vulnerability. But Clara's relief was short-lived. Later that evening, as she fed Lily formula mixed with tap water, guilt crept in like an unwelcome guest. Who was this man to swoop in and play savior? Why did he care about someone like her? Questions swirled in her mind, feeding into her growing unease. Every bite Lily took felt tainted somehow, every swallow accompanied by the bitter taste of indebtedness. Clara hated feeling beholden to anyone, especially someone whose motives she couldn't trust. And yet, as much as she resented Daniel for making her feel small, she couldn't deny the relief his gesture brought, not just for Lily's sake, but for hers too. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, her stomach wasn't hollow with hunger. That night, as Lily slept fitfully beside her, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how far she'd have to fall before hitting rock bottom. What made this crisis so gut-wrenchingly relatable wasn't just its immediacy. It was the universality of its pain. Everyone knows what it's like to stand at a crossroads, paralyzed by fear of making the wrong choice. Everyone has faced moments when pride clashes with necessity, leaving scars no matter which path you choose. Clara's struggle forced the audience to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Would you accept help if it meant swallowing your dignity? Could you forgive yourself for needing someone else? These questions lingered long after the scene ended, creating a tension that pulled viewers deeper into her world. And then there was Daniel, whose presence complicated matters further. While Clara wrestled with her internal conflict, he grappled with his own demons. Offering help hadn't been easy for him. It went against years of conditioning, decades, spent building walls to keep others out. Yet seeing Clara reminded him of all the times he'd turned away from people who needed him most, including his own daughter. Each step he took toward Clara felt like tearing down one of those walls brick by painful brick. But progress came at a cost. Judgment. When word got out among his colleagues that he'd been spotted helping a struggling mother outside a grocery store, whispers began to circulate. Some called it noble, others dismissed it as reckless. Either way, Daniel found himself questioning whether he'd done the right thing or if he'd simply opened another door to heartbreak. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like the world had tilted just enough to let some light in. Clara accepted Daniel's groceries reluctantly, her pride bruised but not broken. And for the first time in weeks, Lily slept soundly through the night without waking up wailing from hunger. The formula lasted longer than Clara expected, stretching thin rations into something resembling stability, or at least the illusion of it. And then came Daniel again, this time with an offer that felt like both salvation and a trap. A job cleaning offices at Hayes Tech, flexible hours designed to accommodate her responsibilities as a mother. At first, Clara hesitated, suspicion prickling at the edges of her gratitude. Why would someone like him, a man who clearly lived in a different universe, go out of his way to help someone like her? But desperation outweighed doubt, and she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she murmured, though the words tasted foreign on her tongue. The new routine brought a fragile sense of order to their lives. Clara worked late, nights after putting Lily down, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins until her hands were raw and cracked. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than anything else she'd done before, and for the first time in months, they weren't. Living paycheck to paycheck. Rent was covered, diapers were stocked, and there was even enough left over for second-hand clothes that didn't smell faintly of mildew. Lily started smiling more, her giggles filling the tiny apartment like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Clara allowed herself to exhale, if only slightly, letting the weight on her shoulders ease just enough to make breathing feel less like drowning. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. At Hayes Tech, whispers followed Clara wherever she went. Some employees admired her resilience, calling her the single mom who doesn't quit. Others whispered behind closed doors, questioning why the CEO himself had taken such an interest in her case. Was she using him? Or worse, was he using her for some kind of publicity stunt? The rumors reached Clara eventually, slipping past office walls and finding their way into her ears during lunch breaks spent alone in a corner of the break room. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the rhythm of mopping floors or wiping down desks, but the doubts crept in anyway, insidious and relentless. What if they were right? What if Daniel's kindness came with strings attached, ones she couldn't see yet but would surely bind her later? Daniel, too, found himself caught in the undertow of his own actions. Helping Clara gave him purpose, a distraction from the emptiness that had settled in his chest since losing touch with Emily. Yet every conversation between them felt tinged with unspoken tension, as though one wrong word might shatter the fragile trust they'd built. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that offering Clara a lifeline wasn't about easing his guilt, but about giving her a chance to rebuild. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging question, am I helping her, or am I trying to save myself? One evening, as Clara clocked out and headed home, she noticed a sleek black car parked near the curb outside the building. Its tinted windows reflected the dim glow of streetlights, hiding whoever sat inside. For a split second, paranoia gripped her, sending a chill down her spine despite the warmth of her jacket. Was someone watching her? Or was she just being paranoid? Reading threats where none existed? Shaking off the thought, she quickened her pace, clutching her bag tighter as she disappeared into the night. Back at the apartment, as Lily drifted off to sleep, Clara sat by the window staring at the city lights beyond the glass. Things were better now, safer. But how long could it last? Every small victory felt precarious, balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip at any moment. She wondered what Daniel stood to gain from all this, and whether she'd be able to walk away when the time came. Because deep down, she knew nothing truly good ever came without a price. And so, as she turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, one question lingered in the darkness. What happens when the cracks start to show, and whose fault will it be when everything falls apart? The fragile piece Clara had stitched together began to unravel one cold Tuesday morning, when a photo surfaced online that turned her fragile sense of security into a house of cards trembling in the wind. Someone, Clara never found out who, had snapped a picture of Daniel handing her groceries outside the grocery store weeks earlier. The image was grainy, but unmistakable, his tailored coat brushing against her worn jacket, her face streaked with tears as Lily cried in her arms. Beneath the photo, a tabloid headline blared across social media feeds. Billionaire CEO plays savior to struggling single mom, but is it charity or PR? At first, Clara didn't notice. She was too busy juggling work shifts and caring for Lily, her days blending into an endless cycle of exhaustion and quiet triumphs. But by mid-morning, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from co-workers' texts and tagged posts. One message stood out, sent by a co-worker named Karen, whose tone oscillated between concern and accusation. "Clara, are you okay? People are saying Daniel only hired you because he wants good press." Her stomach dropped. Clicking through the article, she saw comments flooding in like a tidal wave. some supportive, others cruel. What did she do to deserve this? One user sneered. Another chimed in. Poor girl probably begged him for help. Each word felt like a punch to the gut, reopening wounds she thought she'd buried under layers of resilience. By lunchtime, the whispers followed her into the break room at Hayes Tech. Colleagues avoided eye contact or spoke in hushed tones just loud enough for her to hear. It's not right, someone muttered. He shouldn't mix business with personal drama. For Clara, the betrayal cut deeper than the judgment. She'd trusted Daniel, not fully perhaps, but enough to believe his intentions were genuine. Now, faced with public scrutiny and workplace gossip, she questioned everything. Was she nothing more than a pawn in his game of redemption? Had he used her vulnerability to polish his tarnished reputation? These doubts gnawed at her, poisoning even the smallest victories she'd earned on her own merit. Meanwhile, Daniel bore the brunt of the backlash in his own way. His board of directors called an emergency meeting, accusing him of risking the company's image over what they dismissed as a pet project. Investors grumbled about misplaced priorities, while competitors seized the opportunity to paint him as reckless and self-indulgent. For a man who prided himself on control, the chaos felt suffocating. Yet what stung most wasn't the criticism. It was the realization that he might have made things worse for Clara. He hadn't anticipated how quickly goodwill could curdle into suspicion. That evening, as Clara scrubbed floors on the 15th floor of Hayes Tech headquarters, she overheard two employees talking nearby. Their voices carried through the empty hallway, sharp and unguarded. Honestly, I think she's playing him, one said. No way does someone like her get hired here without strings attached. The other laughed bitterly. Strings, try chains. She'll drag him down if he lets her. Something inside Clara snapped. She straightened abruptly, her mop clattering to the floor. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as anger surged hotter than shame. How dare they reduce her life to speculation, her struggles to gossip? She wanted to confront them, to scream that she wasn't some charity case, that she worked harder than anyone else in that building, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she grabbed her cleaning cart and fled to the stairwell, where she sank onto a cold metal step and let the tears come. Later that night, Daniel knocked on her apartment door holding a folder filled with damage control strategies. He tried to explain, to reassure her that none of this changed his reasons for helping her. But Clara cut him off before he could finish. You think this fixes anything? She demanded, her voice trembling. Do you even realize what it feels like to have strangers dissect your life like it's entertainment? To wonder if every kind gesture comes with strings attached? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, guilt etched across his face. In that moment, neither knew how to bridge the chasm widening between them. All they could see were their own failures reflected in each other's eyes. And as Clara slammed the door shut, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway, both understood that trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired. Now ask yourself, when kindness becomes spectacle, can it still be called kindness? What happens when doing the right thing feels like the worst mistake you've ever made? Because for Clara and Daniel, the hardest battles weren't against hunger or judgment. They were against the fear that no matter how hard they fought, the world would always find ways to tear them apart. The third crisis hit Clara like a freight train, forcing her to confront not just the harsh realities of survival, but the very foundation of who she was. It began with an envelope, thick, cream-colored, and heavy enough to make her heart race as soon as she saw it lying on her kitchen counter. Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000, along with a handwritten note from Daniel. This isn't charity. It's a chance to start over. Use it however you need. Clara stared at the check, her vision blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. The amount was staggering, almost incomprehensible, a lifeline big enough to lift her out of the quicksand of poverty that had been dragging her down for years. With this money, she could pay off back rent, buy groceries without counting, every penny, maybe even enroll in online classes to chase those long-forgotten dreams of becoming a teacher. For Lily, it meant stability, a real bed instead of a second-hand crib, warm clothes that fit properly, doctor's visits without the gnawing fear of how to pay the bill. But as the initial shock wore off, a darker thought crept in. What did he want in return? The question lingered like smoke, filling the room until she couldn't breathe. Accepting help from Daniel had always come with strings, or so she'd convinced herself. But this was different. This wasn't just groceries or a job. This was a life-changing sum of money, the kind of gift that altered destinies. And yet, despite its enormity, it felt tainted. Every time she imagined cashing the check, she pictured whispers behind closed doors, accusations of manipulation or exploitation. Was she selling her dignity for security? Worse still, was she teaching Lily that love and kindness came with conditions? Her internal conflict raged like a storm, each side pulling her in opposite directions. On one hand, pride screamed at her to tear the check into pieces and throw it away. She didn't want to owe anyone anything. Not Daniel. Not the world. She wanted to stand on her own 2 feet, to prove that she could provide for her daughter without relying on handouts. But on the other hand, desperation whispered seductively, reminding her of all the nights Lily had gone to bed hungry, all the times Clara had cried herself to sleep, wondering if they'd ever escape this endless cycle of struggle. Could she really turn down a chance to give her daughter a better life, simply because her pride wouldn't let her accept help? The dilemma consumed her, eating away at whatever fragile piece she'd managed to build. At work, she moved through the motions mechanically, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins while her mind churned with questions she couldn't answer. During breaks, she avoided her co-workers' curious glances, knowing they'd heard about the check by now. Rumors spread faster than wildfire, fueled by jealousy and judgment. "She doesn't deserve that kind of money," someone muttered within earshot. Another chimed in. "What does he expect in return? A thank you letter won't cut it." Each comment sliced deeper, reopening wounds she thought she'd patched up. By the end of her shift, exhaustion weighed so heavily on her shoulders that walking felt like trudging through mud. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching her, waiting to see what she'd do next. Would she take the money and run, proving them right? Or would she reject it and risk losing everything she'd worked so hard to protect? That night, sitting alone in her dimly lit apartment with Lily asleep beside her, Clara wrestled with the decision that would define not just her future, but her identity. Pride versus necessity, independence versus vulnerability, self-respect versus survival. Each choice carried consequences too heavy to bear, yet she knew she couldn't stay frozen forever. As she traced the edge of the envelope with trembling fingers, she found herself asking the same question Daniel had posed weeks earlier. What are you willing to sacrifice for the people you love? For Clara, the stakes weren't just financial, they were moral. Taking the money meant admitting that she couldn't do it alone, that she needed someone else to step in and save her, when she'd promised herself she'd never let anyone have that power over her again. Rejecting it meant clinging to her principles, even if it meant continuing to scrape by while Lily suffered. Either way, she lost something precious. And then there was Daniel, whose intentions remained frustratingly opaque. Part of her wanted to believe he truly cared, that his actions stemmed from genuine compassion rather than guilt or ulterior motives. But another part, the cynical, battle-weary part, couldn't ignore the possibility that this was just another calculated move in his quest for redemption. If she accepted the money, was she enabling him to feel better about himself at her expense? Or was she letting her own mistrust blind her to the possibility of grace? As dawn broke outside her window, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara finally made her decision. She tucked the envelope into her bag and headed to Hayes Tech headquarters, determined to confront Daniel face to face. She didn't know what she'd say when she saw him, only that she couldn't keep running from the truth. Somewhere between pride and desperation lay a path forward, but finding it required answers neither of them was ready to give. Now, ask yourself, if you were Clara, standing at the crossroads of morality and survival, what would you choose? Would you cling to your values, even if it meant sacrificing your child's well-being? Or would you swallow your pride and accept help, no matter the cost? Because sometimes, The hardest choices aren't between right and wrong. They're between two versions of yourself, neither perfect, both flawed. The tension reached its breaking point when Clara arrived at Hayes Tech headquarters, her footsteps echoing hollowly against the marble floors as she clutched the envelope tightly in her hand. The building felt colder than usual, its sterile air, conditioning humming like a countdown to something inevitable. She hadn't called ahead. She didn't need to. Daniel's assistant recognized her immediately, her polished smile faltering slightly before she ushered Clara into his office without a word. Inside, the room was all sharp angles and sleek surfaces, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing inside Clara's chest. Daniel sat behind his desk, typing furiously on his laptop, but he looked up as soon as she entered. His expression shifted, not quite guilt, not quite relief, just an unreadable mask that made her want to scream. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said finally, his voice low and measured as though he were bracing himself for whatever came next. Clara wanted to respond, to tell him exactly what she thought of his check and his so-called generosity, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she placed the envelope on his desk with a deliberate thud, her hands trembling as they hovered over it for just a moment too long. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of everything unsaid. "You don't get to throw money at me like I'm some kind of problem you can fix." Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as though he'd been expecting this reaction, but hadn't prepared for how raw it would feel. "It's not about fixing you, Clara," he replied, his tone calm but tinged with frustration. "It's about giving you options you deserve." But Clara shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face now. "Options? You think I care about options when everyone out there thinks I'm using you? When my co-workers whisper behind my back, calling me names I can't even repeat? Do you have any idea what it feels like to walk through that building every day knowing people are judging me because of you?" Her words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel stood abruptly, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair as he paced toward the window. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, its skyline glittering under the midday sun. He stared out at it, his shoulders tense, before turning back to face her. "And what about Lily?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the silence, like a blade. "Do you really think she deserves to grow up worrying about where her next meal is coming from, or whether the heat will be turned off in the middle of winter?" Clara flinched, as though he'd struck her, her breath hitching. Audibly. That was the cruelest part, that no matter how angry she was, no matter how much pride she clung to, she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Every sacrifice she'd made, every sleepless night spent rocking Lily to sleep, had been for one reason, to give her daughter a better life. And yet, accepting Daniel's help felt like admitting failure, like letting go of the last shred of control she had over their future. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding chaotically until she could barely think straight. Was she willing to risk losing herself entirely if it meant keeping Lily safe? But then came the twist that shattered what little remained of Clara's fragile world. As Daniel opened his mouth to speak again, his phone buzzed loudly on the desk. He glanced at it briefly, frowning, before picking it up and reading the message. Whatever it said drained the color from his face, leaving him pale and visibly shaken. "It's CPS," he murmured almost to himself, before looking at Clara with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "They've received reports about neglect. Someone filed a complaint." The room seemed to tilt sideways, the floor falling out from beneath Clara's feet. Neglect? The word hit her like a punch to the gut, stealing her breath and leaving her dizzy. How could anyone accuse her of neglecting Lily? The very thing she lived for, the reason she got up every morning despite the odds stacked against her. Panic surged through her veins, hot and electric, as she grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. "Who?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Who would say something like that?" Daniel hesitated, his jaw tightening as though he were weighing his next words carefully. "It doesn't matter who," he said finally. "What matters is what happens next. If we don't act quickly, they'll take Lily away, permanently." The threat loomed over them like a storm cloud ready to burst, casting a shadow so dark it obliterated everything else. Clara's knees buckled, forcing her to sit down before she collapsed completely. She clutched her arms around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of a life that suddenly felt like it was crumbling apart. All those whispered accusations, all those judgmental stares, they weren't just cruel gossip anymore. They were weapons aimed directly at her heart, threatening to destroy the one thing she loved most. As Daniel explained the steps they needed to take, legal representation, character witnesses, proof of stability, Clara barely heard him. Her mind spiraled, replaying every mistake, every misstep, every moment she'd failed to shield Lily from the harshness of their reality. Had she worked too many hours, skipped too many meals, left Lily alone for too long while scrambling to make ends meet? Each question cut deeper than the last, slicing open wounds she thought she'd buried long ago. And yet, amid the panic and self-recrimination, a fierce determination began to rise within her. No matter what happened, no matter how hard the fight ahead might be, she would not let anyone take Lily away. Not CPS, not Daniel, not the entire world conspiring against her. This was her daughter, her responsibility, her love, and she would burn everything down before she let go. Now, ask yourself, when faced with the ultimate test of motherhood, how far would you go to protect your child? Would you swallow your pride and accept help from someone you barely trust? Would you fight tooth and nail against a system designed to tear families apart? Because for Clara, the stakes had never been higher, and neither had the cost of losing. The hours leading up to the CPS hearing felt like walking across a tightrope stretched over an abyss, each step heavier than the last. Clara sat in Daniel's car as they drove toward the courthouse, her hands gripping the edges of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The city blurred past outside the window, grey buildings, flashing lights, strangers rushing somewhere important, but none of it registered. Her mind was consumed by one thought. What if I'm not enough? Despite Daniel's reassurances, despite the stack of paperwork he'd gathered to prove her stability, she couldn't shake the fear that it wouldn't be enough, that no matter how hard she fought, someone would decide Lily deserved better. Better food, a better home, a better mother. Daniel glanced at her occasionally, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He wasn't just nervous for Clara, he was terrified for himself. This moment represented everything he'd been running from for years: failure, regret, the crushing weight of knowing he hadn't done enough when it mattered most. If CPS took Lily away today, he knew he'd see Emily's face in every courtroom chair, hear her voice in every whispered accusation. Would helping Clara redeem him, or would it confirm what he feared most, that he was incapable of saving anyone? When they arrived at the courthouse, the scene outside only amplified the tension. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras clicking like gunfire as microphones were thrust into their faces. "Clara, is it true Daniel Hayes has been financially supporting you?" one shouted. Another followed up with, "Mr. Hayes, are you trying to buy your way out of guilt over your estranged daughter?" Clara shrank back instinctively, shielding Lily with her body as Daniel ushered them through the chaos. His hand briefly touched hers to guide her forward, but even that small gesture felt loaded with meaning. Was he protecting her or controlling? Neither of them dared to ask. Inside, the waiting area buzzed with quiet murmurs and anxious energy. Families huddled together, some crying softly while others stared blankly at the walls. A woman clutching a toddler nearby shot Clara a sympathetic look before turning away quickly, as though empathy itself might invite judgment. Clara rocked, Lily gently in her arms, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, pressing kisses to the top of her head. "We're going to be okay." But deep down, doubt gnawed at her resolve. What if the judge saw her as everyone else did? A struggling single mom who couldn't provide? What if all her sacrifices counted for nothing in the eyes of people who didn't know her story? As they waited, Daniel reviewed the case file one last time, flipping through pages filled with financial statements, character references, and letters from daycare providers attesting to Clara's dedication as a parent. It was thorough, meticulous, and still it felt fragile. One wrong word, one misinterpreted glance could unravel everything. When their names were finally called, Clara stood abruptly, steadying herself against the wall before stepping into the courtroom. The air inside was heavy, tinged with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee. At the front, the judge sat impassively behind a raised bench, her expression unreadable. CPS representatives lined up on one side, their demeanor professional yet clinical, while Daniel positioned himself beside Clara like a silent guardian. Before the proceedings began, the opposing counsel leaned in to whisper something to their client, their lips curling into a smug smile. Clara's stomach churned. Whatever they had planned, it wasn't good. And then came the question that made her blood run cold. Did Daniel's involvement undermine Clara's ability to care for Lily independently? Was this act of kindness proof that she needed external support to function as a parent? Now imagine sitting there in Clara's place, your child's future hanging by a thread. What would you say to convince the court and yourself that you're capable of being the parent your child deserves? How far would you go to prove that love isn't measured in dollars or stability, but in sacrifice and devotion? Because in moments like these, the truth becomes both weapon and shield. Stay tuned for the emotional climax of Clara's journey, where hope battles fear and redemption hangs in the balance. Subscribe now to follow this raw, unforgettable story of resilience and transformation. You won't want to miss what happens next. Clara stood at the center of the courtroom, her legs trembling beneath her as though they might give way at any moment. The air was thick with tension, each breath she took shallow and labored, as if even oxygen had turned against her. Every eye in the room seemed to bore into her. Judges, lawyers, social workers, all waiting for her to speak, to defend herself, to prove that she was worthy of being a mother. But the words caught in her throat, tangled up in fear and doubt, leaving her frozen under the weight of their collective gaze. Lily sat quietly in her lap, blissfully unaware of the storm raging around her, her tiny fingers clutching Clara's shirt like an anchor. The CPS attorney rose from his seat, his voice clipped and clinical as he laid out their case. Ms. Thompson has demonstrated patterns of instability, he began, gesturing toward documents spread across the table. Missed rent payments, inconsistent employment history, reliance on external support. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow, echoing in Clara's ears long after the words faded. Reliance on external support. That phrase stung the most, not because it wasn't true, but because it twisted Daniel's kindness into something ugly, something transactional. She glanced at him briefly, sitting rigid beside her, his face unreadable but his hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Was this what he'd feared all along? That his help would be used against her? When it was finally her turn to speak, Clara hesitated, her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. Her mouth felt dry, her tongue heavy, but then she looked down at Lily, whose wide blue eyes stared back at her with unshakable trust. Something inside her shifted, a spark igniting in the darkness. She straightened slightly, drawing strength from the warmth of her daughter pressed against her chest. "I'm not perfect," she began, her voice quavering but clear. "I've made mistakes, so many mistakes, but I have never stopped fighting for my daughter. Not once." Her words poured out like water breaking through a dam, raw and unfiltered. She spoke of the night she'd gone without food so Lily could eat, the hours spent scrubbing floors until her hands bled just to keep a roof over their heads, the dreams she'd buried deep inside because survival came first. "I don't need anyone to tell me I'm not enough," she said, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "Because every single day I wake up and choose her, over myself, over everything." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. They were part of the truth, part of the fight. Daniel watched her intently, his own guilt warring with admiration. He'd come here to protect her, to shield her from judgment, but now he realized she didn't need shielding. Clara was fire wrapped in vulnerability, fierce and unrelenting in her love for Lily. Still, when the CPS attorney turned his attention to Daniel, asking pointedly about his motivations, the spotlight shifted uncomfortably onto him. "Mr. Hayes," the lawyer drawled, "would you say your involvement with Ms. Thompson stems from altruism or personal redemption?" The question hit like a punch to the gut, forcing Daniel to confront the very thing he'd been avoiding, his own brokenness. For years, he'd convinced himself that helping others was enough to fill the void left by Emily's absence. But standing there, watching Clara pour her soul into defending her child, he understood the truth. His actions weren't just about Clara, they were about him, about proving to himself that he wasn't the failure his estranged daughter believed him to be. Maybe both, he admitted softly, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't intended. But that doesn't change the fact that Clara deserves better than what life has given her, and so does Lily. The judge listened silently, her expression inscrutable as she absorbed every word. When the final arguments concluded, she excused herself to deliberate, leaving the courtroom suspended in limbo. Clara sank back into her chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. Daniel leaned closer, offering quiet reassurances, but neither knew whether it would be enough. Outside, reporters still lingered, their cameras flashing like vultures circling prey. Inside, time slowed to a crawl, each second stretching endlessly as they waited for the verdict that would determine their futures. As the judge returned, her gavel tapping sharply against the wood, Clara held her breath, bracing for impact. This was it, the moment where hope collided with despair, where love faced judgment head-on. And yet, as she clutched Lily tightly to her chest, she felt something unexpected. Peace. No matter the outcome, she had fought. She had shown the world and herself that she was more than the sum of her struggles. Now ask yourself, in the face of impossible odds, how do we find the courage to stand tall? Is it pride, love, or sheer desperation that drives us to confront our greatest fears? Because for Clara, the battle wasn't just for custody, it was for identity, dignity, and the right to call herself a mother. The judge's voice cut through the tense silence. Like a blade, her words deliberate and measured as she delivered her verdict. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, she began, her tone neutral but firm. This court finds that Ms. Clara Thompson has demonstrated sufficient capacity to provide for her child. Relief washed over Clara in an overwhelming wave, her knees buckling slightly as tears streamed down her face. She hugged Lily tightly, whispering prayers of gratitude into her daughter's hair. But just as Daniel started to rise from his seat, ready to congratulate her, the judge added one final statement. However, given the circumstances surrounding external support, we recommend a 6-month probationary period during which Ms. Thompson must demonstrate full independence. Independence. The word hung heavy in the air, sinking into Clara's chest like lead. She had won, but only halfway. For the next 6 months, she would have to prove she could stand on her own without relying on anyone else, not even Daniel. As they left the courtroom, reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing wildly, Clara felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. She had fought for Lily, but now the fight wasn't over. It had merely shifted shape. Back at Daniel's car, parked under the shadow of the courthouse, Clara turned to him with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "For everything." Daniel nodded, offering a small, sad smile. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "You did this yourself." But before he could say more, Clara handed him an envelope, the same one containing the $10,000 check he'd offered her days ago. "I can't take this," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "Not anymore." Daniel hesitated, his fingers brushing against the envelope as though it might burn him. "Clara, please," he urged, his voice tinged with desperation. "You need this, Lily needs this." But Clara shook her head, her expression unyielding. "No," she said, her voice breaking slightly but still resolute. "I need to do this my way, without help, from anyone." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, forcing him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. His presence in her life wasn't just about helping her, it was about saving himself. As Clara walked away, cradling Lily in her arms, Daniel stood frozen, watching her disappear into the crowd. He wanted to follow her, to argue, to convince her that she didn't have to face this alone, but deep down, he understood. This wasn't just about pride or proving herself. It was about reclaiming her identity. And maybe, just maybe, letting her go was the most selfless thing he could do. But then came the twist neither of them saw coming. Later that evening, as Clara tucked Lily into bed in their tiny apartment, there was a knock at the door. She opened it cautiously, only to find Emily Hayes, Daniel's estranged daughter, standing on the other side. Emily looked nervous but determined, clutching a folder filled with papers. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice hesitant. "My dad told me about your situation. I thought maybe we could help each other." Inside the folder were resources Clara hadn't known existed: grants for single mothers, free childcare programs, affordable housing options. Emily explained that she worked with a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families in crisis. "I know what it's like to feel abandoned by someone who should have been there," Emily admitted, glancing down at her hands. "And I don't want you to feel like you're doing this alone." Clara stared at her, stunned. This wasn't part of the plan. Not hers, not Daniel's. Yet here was Emily extending a lifeline not out of obligation, but out of shared pain. In that moment, Clara realized that redemption wasn't a solo journey. It was something earned, together through forgiveness, connection, and trust. Now ask yourself, what happens when the person you least expect becomes your greatest ally? How far would you go to rebuild not just your life, but someone else's? Because sometimes the most unexpected twists lead to the deepest transformations. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge expectations and redefine hope. Subscribe now to experience narratives filled with heart-stopping surprises and unforgettable characters. You won't believe what comes next. Clara sat on the edge of her bed later that night, Emily's folder spread across her lap like a map, leading out of the wilderness. The apartment was quiet except for Lily's soft breathing in the crib beside her, rhythmic and steady, a sound that had become Clara's anchor through months of chaos. She flipped through the pages slowly, absorbing every detail: grant applications, childcare resources, housing assistance programs. It wasn't just information, it was possibility, a lifeline offered not with strings attached but with understanding. For the first time since this ordeal began, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. But it wasn't the kind of hope born from rescue or charity. It was the kind forged in fire, tempered by struggle and sacrifice. As she traced her fingers over the neatly typed paragraphs, Clara realized how far she'd come, not just physically surviving. Eviction notices and empty cupboards, but emotionally, shedding layers of shame and fear that had weighed her down for so long. She thought back to the woman who'd huddled against the cold brick wall outside the grocery store, clutching a crumpled $5 bill as though it were her last shred of dignity. That version of herself seemed distant now, almost unrecognizable. She wasn't broken anymore, at least not in the same way. Her cracks had been filled with gold, kintsugi style, each one a testament to what she'd endured and overcome. The internal conflict that had consumed her, pride versus necessity, independence versus vulnerability, no longer felt like opposing forces tearing her apart. Instead, they existed together, balanced precariously but harmoniously within her. Accepting help didn't mean losing herself. It meant finding strength in community, in connection, in shared humanity. And rejecting Daniel's money hadn't been about proving anything to him or the world. It had been about proving something to herself. She could stand on her own 2 feet, yes, but she didn't have to do it alone. There was power in asking for help when needed, just as there was courage in saying no when it mattered most. Her thoughts drifted to Daniel, whose presence loomed large even in his absence. He'd entered her life at a moment of sheer desperation, offering kindness wrapped in guilt and regret. At first, she'd resented him for it, for making her feel small, for complicating an already fragile existence. But now, looking back, she saw the truth he'd tried to hide beneath polished shoes and tailored suits. He was as lost as she was, searching for redemption in someone else's story because his own felt irreparably broken. In helping her, he'd begun to heal himself, and maybe, just maybe, she'd done the same for him. Then there was Emily, whose unexpected appearance flipped everything upside down. Clara hadn't known what to expect when she opened the door earlier that evening, but seeing Daniel's estranged daughter standing there vulnerable and sincere had shifted something inside her. Their bond was tentative, built on shared pain rather than blood, yet it carried a weight that felt profound. Through Emily, Clara glimpsed a future where forgiveness wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Forgiveness for others, for circumstances, beyond control, and most importantly for oneself. As dawn broke outside her window, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Clara made a decision. She would use the resources Emily provided, not as a crutch, but as tools to build a better life for Lily. She would embrace the probationary period not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to redefine what independence truly meant. And she would let go of the anger and mistrust that had kept her isolated for so long, choosing instead to open her heart to the people who cared enough to step into her chaos. By the time Lily woke up, cooing softly in her crib, Clara was already dressed and ready to face the day. She picked up her daughter, holding her close as sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting golden patterns on the floor. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice steady and sure. "Better than okay. Now ask yourself, when? Faced with life's hardest lessons, how do we find the strength to transform them into stepping stones? What does it take to forgive, not just others, but ourselves, and emerge stronger on the other side?" Because Clara's journey reminds us that growth isn't linear, redemption isn't perfect, and sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within our own hearts. 6 months passed in a blur of early mornings, late nights, and countless small victories that added up to something Clara could finally call stability. The probationary period imposed by CPS had been grueling, a gauntlet designed not just to test her ability to provide for Lily, but to strip away every illusion she'd clung to about herself. Yet as the final day approached, Clara stood outside. Her new apartment, a modest one-bedroom on the second floor of a freshly renovated building, and felt an unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest: peace. Not the fragile kind that shatters at the first sign of trouble, but the steady, grounding kind that comes from knowing you've earned your place in the world. The journey hadn't been easy. She'd juggled 2 jobs, cleaning offices during graveyard shifts and working part-time at a daycare center, to make ends meet while navigating the labyrinth of grants and resources Emily had introduced her to. Some days exhaustion clawed at her so fiercely she thought she might collapse. Other days doubt whispered cruelly in her ear, reminding her of all the ways she'd failed before. But through it all, she kept going. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. For Lily, for herself, for the future they were building together, brick by painstaking brick. On the morning of the final evaluation, Clara dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were simple yet polished: dark jeans, a cream sweater, and flats that clicked softly against the pavement as she walked to the courthouse. Lily sat contentedly in her stroller, bundled in a warm coat Emily had gifted her weeks earlier, giggling at the crisp autumn leaves swirling around them. As they entered the courthouse, Clara noticed how different everything felt compared to 6 months ago. The reporters were gone, replaced by quiet hallways and muted conversations. Even the judge's stern expression seemed less intimidating now, softened perhaps by the stack of glowing progress reports submitted by social workers who'd visited Clara's home multiple times over the past months. When the judge spoke, her voice carried none of the clinical detachment Clara remembered from their first encounter. "Ms. Thompson," she began, her tone almost gentle, "you've demonstrated remarkable resilience and commitment throughout this process." She paused, glancing down at the file in front of her. "Your efforts have not only met, but exceeded our expectations. Custody of your daughter is fully restored without condition." Clara exhaled sharply, tears welling up in her eyes as relief washed over her like a tidal wave. Beside her, Lily babbled happily, completely unaware of the magnitude of the moment. Clara knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We did it, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. "We're free." But the resolution wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. That evening, after tucking Lily into bed, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the folder Emily had given her months ago. Its edges were worn now, pages dog-eared from frequent use, but its contents represented more than resources. They symbolized connection. Through Emily, Clara had learned that redemption wasn't a solitary act. It was a shared journey. And, though Daniel hadn't been directly involved since she returned his check, his influence lingered in subtle ways. His initial gesture of kindness, however flawed, had set off a chain reaction that led Clara to reclaim not just her independence, but her humanity. A few days later, Clara received a letter from Daniel. It was brief but heartfelt, written in his precise, measured handwriting. "I hope you know I'll always be rooting for you," he wrote. "You've reminded me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let go and trust others to find their own way." Enclosed was a photograph of him with Emily, standing side by side at some charity event. Their smiles were tentative but genuine, proof that even fractured relationships could mend given enough time and effort. Clara stared at the picture for a long moment before tucking it into a drawer, alongside the envelope containing the uncashed check. Neither needed revisiting. They were artifacts of a chapter closed. As winter settled over Michigan, bringing snowflakes that dusted rooftops and streets like powdered sugar, Clara found herself reflecting on the transformation she'd undergone. She wasn't the same woman who'd once sat crying outside a grocery store, paralyzed by fear and hunger. She was stronger now, wiser, more compassionate, not just toward others, but toward herself. She still carried scars, visible and invisible, but they no longer defined her. They were reminders of where she'd been, not limitations on where she could go. One evening, as she rocked Lily to sleep, humming a lullaby her own mother used to sing, Clara realized something profound. Survival wasn't the end goal. It was the starting point. From here, she could dream again. Maybe not of college or teaching right away, but of possibilities that stretched beyond mere subsistence. A better life for Lily, a fuller life for herself. Now ask yourself, what does it mean to truly overcome adversity? Is it about erasing pain or learning to carry it gracefully? Because Clara's story reminds us that resolution isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. And sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the sweetest victories. Clara's life began to take on a rhythm she hadn't thought possible 6 months earlier, one that felt less like survival and more like living. The apartment she'd moved into with the help of Emily's non-profit connections was small but filled with light, its windows overlooking a park where Lily could toddle after leaves or chase pigeons while Clara watched from a nearby bench. It wasn't luxury. It still required careful budgeting and long hours at work, but it was hers. Every time she unlocked the front door, she felt a surge of pride, as though crossing a threshold into a future she'd once only dreamed about. Her hands, calloused from years of scrubbing floors and gripping mops, now turned pages of library, books borrowed for Lily, their colorful illustrations sparking laughter in her daughter's wide blue eyes. Lily herself seemed to thrive under this newfound stability. She walked confidently now, her tiny sneakers squeaking against wooden floors as she explored every corner of their home. Her giggles echoed through the apartment, filling spaces that had once been heavy with silence and fear. For Clara, those sounds were more than just joy. They were reminders of why she'd fought so hard, why she'd refused to let anyone take her child away. Watching Lily grow stronger each day reinforced something Clara had come to believe deeply. Love wasn't measured in material wealth, but in sacrifice, patience, and presence. Daniel's role in her life had shifted dramatically since she returned his uncashed check. He didn't call or visit, respecting the boundaries she'd set, but occasionally Clara received updates through Emily. Daniel had reconnected with his estranged daughter, taking tentative steps toward rebuilding their fractured relationship. They met weekly for coffee, awkward at first but gradually becoming easier, as though rediscovering what it meant to be family. Emily confided in Clara during one of their monthly check-ins that Daniel often spoke of her, not with regret, but with admiration. "He says you taught him how to trust again," Emily said softly, stirring sugar into her tea. "Not just others, but himself." For Clara, hearing this stirred emotions she hadn't expected, gratitude mixed with lingering sadness. She understood, now that Daniel's initial gesture of kindness hadn't just been about guilt or redemption, it had been an attempt to bridge gaps he couldn't yet see within himself. In helping her, he'd begun to heal wounds he'd carried silently for years, and in rejecting his money, Clara had forced him to confront his own limitations, pushing him toward growth he might never have achieved otherwise. Their lives were intertwined not because they needed each other anymore, but because they'd changed each other irrevocably. Emily too had grown in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. What started as a professional connection blossomed into genuine friendship, rooted in shared struggles rather than convenience. Emily introduced Clara to a network of single mothers navigating similar challenges, women who became both confidants and allies. Together they exchanged stories over potluck dinners, swapped tips on affordable childcare, and celebrated milestones big and small. Through these relationships, Clara realized she wasn't alone. That strength came not from enduring hardships in isolation, but from leaning on others when necessary. Vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was courage. Work also transformed for Clara. At the daycare center, she earned promotions quickly, her dedication catching the attention of supervisors who valued her ability to connect with children. Parents praised her patience and creativity, marveling at how she seemed to understand exactly what their kids needed, even before they did. By night, her office cleaning shifts dwindled as she pursued certifications in early childhood education. Online, fueled by a dream reignited, teaching. Each class brought her closer to a goal she'd nearly abandoned, reminding her that dreams deferred weren't dreams denied. As winter gave way to spring, Clara stood outside her building one afternoon, watching Lily chase butterflies in the park across the street. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the promise of renewal, and sunlight warmed her face as she closed her eyes briefly, letting the moment sink in. This was her life now, not perfect, but whole. She thought about the grocery store parking lot, where it had all begun, the cold biting through her jacket, the weight of despair pressing down on her shoulders. That version of herself felt distant now, almost like someone else entirely. Yet she knew she owed that woman gratitude for fighting, for surviving, for refusing to give up. And then there was Daniel, whose name still surfaced occasionally, in news articles about Hayes Tech's latest innovations or philanthropic ventures. Clara skimmed them without lingering, no longer angry or resentful, but grateful for the part he'd played in her journey. His redemption story mirrored hers in some ways, a man learning to forgive himself, to embrace vulnerability as a form of strength. Though their paths had diverged, their impact on each other remained undeniable. Now ask yourself, how do we measure transformation? Is it in the distance between who we were and who we've become, or in the connections we forge along the way? Because Clara's story reminds us that change isn't solitary. It ripples outward, touching lives far beyond our own. The story of Clara, Daniel, and Emily is one that lingers not because of its dramatic twists or emotional crescendos, but because it reflects truths we've all faced in some form, truths about resilience, redemption, and the fragile yet unbreakable bonds of humanity. At its core, this narrative asks us to consider what it means to truly help someone without stripping them of their dignity. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about independence, vulnerability, and the blurred lines between giving and receiving. And perhaps most profoundly, it reminds us that transformation isn't a solitary act. It's a shared journey, shaped by the people who walk beside us, even when we can't see them clearly. Clara's journey teaches us that survival isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about finding meaning within it. Her initial instinct was to shield herself from judgment, to prove she didn't need anyone else. But over time, she learned that strength doesn't lie in isolation. It lies in connection. Accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Asking for support didn't diminish her worth, it amplified it. In real life, how often do we resist reaching out because we fear appearing incapable or unworthy? How many times have we shouldered burdens alone, convinced that asking for help makes us less than whole? Clara's evolution invites us to reconsider those fears, to trust that leaning on others doesn't erode our identity but enriches it. Daniel's arc mirrors Clara's in ways both subtle and striking. His attempts to fix Clara stemmed not from arrogance but from guilt, a desperate attempt to rewrite his own failures with Emily. Yet through his interactions with Clara, he came to understand something profound. Redemption isn't earned by fixing others, it's found by confronting yourself. For Daniel, helping Clara wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a mirror reflecting his deepest insecurities and regrets. Real-life parallels abound here. How often do we project our unresolved pain onto others, hoping to ease our guilt by playing savior? What would happen if instead we turned inward, acknowledging our flaws and seeking forgiveness, not as absolution but as growth? Emily's role adds another layer to the story, illustrating how broken relationships can mend when met with patience and understanding. Her decision to step into Clara's life wasn't altruistic, it was reciprocal. She saw herself in Clara's struggles, recognizing fragments of her own pain reflected back at her. Through their friendship, both women healed wounds they might never have addressed alone. This speaks to a universal truth. Healing isn't linear, nor is it confined to individual journeys. Sometimes, repairing one part of your life requires mending another, and vice versa. Think about the people in your own life who've shown up unexpectedly during moments of crisis. Did their presence change you? How did you change them? These lessons converge in a single idea. Transformation begins where resistance ends. Whether it's letting go of pride, embracing vulnerability, or forgiving ourselves and others, change demands surrender, not defeat, but release. It asks us to stop fighting against the tide and start flowing with it, trusting that the current will carry us somewhere better, even if we can't see the shore yet. Now ask yourself, when has someone extended a hand to you in a moment of need, and how did it shape the person you are today? Have you ever been the helper, offering support without expecting anything in return? Share your stories in the comments below, because every act of kindness, no matter how small, ripples outward, touching, lives in ways we may never fully understand.